who's there.
Right, you can see names if you go into where it says participants. There are two panels. One says panelists and one attendees. So speaking of attendees, and that's a funny terminology, but we welcome everyone who is joining us this evening. Thank you for being with us. And I'm going to just quickly introduce myself if I haven't met you yet in person or online. My name is Rabbi Dan Geffen. I'm very honored to be the Rabbi of Temple Addis Israel in Sag Harbor. Before I introduce our incredible panelists and teachers for this evening, I just want to turn it over to one of the co-chairs of our Social Justice Committee, Andrea Klausner, just to give a few words of introduction.
Well, on behalf of my co-chair, Alyssa Peak, would like to welcome all of you to our third webinar in our continuing series of education and healing regarding racism and social justice. And we're very excited to have our panelists with us. And we hope you'll join us in questioning our wonderful speakers and learning and finding out how to get more involved. The purpose of our Social Justice Committee is to build bridges within our community, not walls. So welcome, and we hope you enjoy tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Andy and Alyssa. I'll gently move you back to the other area, I think, here in a second. But just as I do, I want to make a note, which is very important. Tonight, there is no chat function, but you can use what's called a QA function at the bottom of the screen, wherever your menu is, and you can offer questions that we will then hopefully have a chance to offer to our panelists tonight. But you can submit them through that, and I will do my very best to run the show from there. So with that, if you'll just give me 1 second, and I'll just put Andy and Alyssa. Isn't that a strange thing that you can just make people disappear like that? I don't think that I enjoy it. I feel terrible about it, actually.
Internet.
Internet. So I want to take a moment, first of all, just to offer my gratitude and my thanks to all three of you, and I'll give you your formal introductions in a second. But to know that this is certainly an important conversation, not just for our Temple community, but as we've seen, for the wider community on the East End, and especially realizing that tonight, and we're really very appreciative, Mark, certainly of you having here, and I don't want to make any offense, but having a younger generation represented for us, and I like to think that I'm somehow both in the younger generation and the older generation at the same time, but it's an important piece of this. And actually, when I wrote to the congregation after George Floyd's death, one of the things that I noted was, as I went to Bridgehampton and as I went to Sag Harbor and I looked around and I saw who was leading the march, right? Who was in front of the line. Normally, in my experience the last 6 years, whenever there's been a matter of protest, it's been clergy that are usually at the forefront. I was so happy to see that, in fact, we weren't anywhere near the front, that, in fact, people like Andrina and Skyler were right up there. This was organized by our young people, and that ultimately speaking, our inspiration and our needed pushing is going to come from the voices of our next generation. So really having all three of you on here certainly is very important. And Andrina and Skyler, adding that special element of your experience is really greatly appreciated. So I want to just introduce all of our speakers, and I apologize, I am at home, as you can imagine, so if you see a small naked running child at some point or another, a dog, you'll forgive me, they're wonderful people, I promise, and dogs. So on our bottom right, at least on my screen, Skyler Johnson is a 20-year-old activist. At that, I had to stop for a second and remember what I was like at 20 years old, and I don't think that I would have been defined by anything that positive. So kudos to you right off the bat. And for those that don't know, Skyler formerly ran for the New York State Senate and is currently a leader of the group Suffolk Progressives. He dedicates his time to fighting for a number of social causes, including the Black Lives Matter movement. So Skyler, we thank you so much for being here, and we really appreciate, again, the perspective that you will bring for us.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've already interrupted you. I feel terrible. This is, Rabbi, come on. On my bottom left, as I can see, Andrina Wekontash Smith is a Shinnecock storyteller, writer, and performer who has spent her career exploring the various components of the human condition. A recently staged reading of Africaville that she directed at Guildhall explored Black communities throughout the 20th century and the sacrifices and injustices that they endured while struggling to exist in a white world. Prior to COVID, she was a writer-performer at The Pit in New York City. and Andrina's solo work has been featured in festivals throughout New York City and the tri-state area. She has performed locally at both Bay Street and Guildhall, and headed a successful summer theater program at the Ross School in East Hampton, as well as being an alumnus of the Watermill Center Arts in Residence program. Her work has been seen in The Pit, Upright Citizens Brigade, which is incredibly impressive, Diverse AF, which I will leave to you to look up what that means, festival, SoloCom, and the Downtown Urban Theater Festival. So Andrina, we thank you for being here with us tonight as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everyone in the congregation here to have this really important conversation. I'm honored that all of your intentions are so aligned with what's needed right now. And I'm just excited to dig in and have a conversation with you all.
Appreciate that very much. We are excited too. And last but not least, in at least my top left box, Mark Nason is a professor of history and African American studies at Fordham University and is the founder and director of the Bronx African American History Project, one of the largest community-based oral history projects in the nation. He has brought his research into more than 20 Bronx schools, as well as Bronx-based cultural organizations and NGOs. Mark is the author of 7 books and more than 300 articles on African American history, labor history, urban history, and the history of popular culture. His first book, Communists in Harlem in the Depression, published in 1983, is still in print and is used in undergraduate and graduate courses around the nation. So Mark, we thank you for being here as well, and I should say professor, and we really appreciate your perspective and your help here as well. And just for the outset, as just to explain how this evening will go, I think that Mark is going to begin with a little bit of a historical perspective. And then we have some pre-submitted questions that we can use for some amount of conversation, and Skyler and Andrina will hopefully be able to give us a little bit of a sense of what their experience was like growing up on the eastern parts of Long Island. And as they have indicated to us from the very beginning, their interest really is in having, exactly as Andrina said, right, a conversation that may occasionally be challenging or pushing us to consider things that we maybe have taken for granted. But that is the purpose of our evening, and the purpose of all of this work is really formative education. The education that we did not receive and should have received, and starting to fill in some of the very, very important parts of the conversation that I can only speak for myself and for our community that we realize very much have been missing. So we really thank you, all three of you, for being with us tonight. And at this point, I guess, Mark, I will turn it over to you. And yeah.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, thank you, Rabbi Geffen. Thank you, Andrina and Skyler, for being part of this. Thank you to my friend Howie Lippman, for my tennis partner and friend, for recommending that I do this. So most of this evening, you're going to hear from Andrina and Skyler. What I want to do is put the Black Lives Matter movement in historical perspective and emphasize why it is overwhelmingly a young people's movement and why it's not going away. So let me start out with a statement from the New York Times. The Black Lives Matter movement is the largest social movement in the history of the modern United States. At its peak, there were 1,500 different protests in cities and towns around the country. We saw this out in the East End. Not only were there protests in Bridgehampton, East Hampton, and Sag Harbor, but in places where protests would have seemed unimaginable, like Montauk and Hampton Bays, which are not exactly hotbeds of liberalism. My own students at Fordham, and this is just my students, participated in 51 different protests, many of them in small towns, some of them in large cities like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Madrid, Spain. So we have something of an extraordinary size just in terms of the protests. But we also have the institutional influence. If any of you are basketball fans and watch the NBA or the WNBA, you know, the courts in the bubble where both leagues are playing and have Black Lives Matter on the floor. everybody is wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt. In the WNBA, it has a Breonna Taylor tribute, Say Her Name. The most extraordinary thing also happened at the opening day of the Yankees. When the Yankees, every player on both teams took a knee before the national anthem. So we see this even in European soccer leagues. We even saw it at a tennis tournament in Kentucky where Black Lives Matter was on the wall. So what it's also affecting our businesses and our schools, that every institution in this country is being challenged to examine its own relationship to the Black community, its own history of racism and white supremacy. And I can tell you this is going on at my university, but and virtually every university in the country. But it's both of my children work in finance, their companies, it's going on. It's going on among, even in real estate companies. I was invited to speak to Compass Realty about police practices. So we're talking about something of tremendous breadth and depth. And it's a movement that is overwhelmingly driven by young people. Rabbi Geffen mentioned that in many protests in the past, the clergy was in the lead. I was at the vigil in Sag Harbor where my family attacked me because I was the oldest person there and didn't keep social distance in the march. It was led by high school and college students. And this is, it's young people who are pushing this forward. And if I'm thinking about how to explain this, it's not only the horror emergence or reemergence, which was the George Floyd murder. Have any of you seen Dave Chappelle's show, 8 minutes, 46 seconds, that you had for the whole country to see a man being smothered to death by the knee of a police officer? That particular incident was the straw that broke the camel's back. But this is also a response to the upsurge of racism and white supremacy, with also strong components of anti-Semitism that we saw first in response to the Obama presidency and is only, magnified during the Trump presidency. And young people looking at this are fed up with a whole portion of the country feeling that Black people, Latinx people, are vulnerable, are targets that you can successfully attack. There's one other thing that has been going on, and that is the historical investigation, which is uncovering the depth of the brutality, the dehumanization, the violence, and the profit-taking at the heart of America's racial history. More and more research is being done that's letting us know slavery was much worse than we ever thought it was. Not so much in physical brutality, but in the routine selling of slaves away from their family and the forced marches of slaves, across country from the upper South to the cotton, growing regions of the lower South. That if we're having a symbol of American slavery, it's the auction block as much as the whip. And this is coming forward. Now, we're also learning about racial pogroms, massacres of African-American communities, which were either successful or dared to resist. How many people here know what happened in Tulsa in 1921? you know, where the most successful and wealthiest Black community in the country was destroyed and hundreds of people killed. In Jewish history, we call those pogroms. We had numerous racial pogroms in the United States. And these are what, you know, the young scholars of African-American history are teaching this now. And my students are hearing this, and that makes them even less willing to accept the upsurge of racism and white supremacy that we've seen for the last 10 years. So, you know, there's a song from Donna Summer, "Enough is enough is enough," if any of you remember the 70s. And we're at that moment. And our young people are the ones leading this. They're not going to let us drop this. I can tell you, my students won't let people at the university drop this. They won't let even the professors drop it. And, you know, at Fordham, for example, the athletes have, you know, approached the coaches and said, what are you going to do about this? This is unheard of, but that's happening around the country. So for those of us out on the East End, you know, I think we need to listen to what young people of color, young Black people have to say about what life has been like for them and what this movement means to them. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Andrina and Skyler, and let them take it away.
Hi, Mark, thank you so much for sharing. Guys, I apologize for snapping out. I normally live in Brooklyn. COVID has caused the city to not be the city. And so I've come out east and I'm at family's house, but family's house means that you are with family, and they see you on their computer and they're like, but what? No, you're just, oh no, I'm like, I'm talking to a congregation, fam. So, one of the things that you said, Mark, that really that stood out to me is the fact that there are people who still think that this can go somewhere. Because for me, this is not something that has now risen to the top and I'm discovering. This has been my life. This has been from zero to current. I've had to navigate through a white lens and landscape. So racism was the language that I had to become fluent in order to survive. And so, yes, it's in your schools, it's in your neighborhoods, it's from the little nice woman down the street, because someone can be nice and still be racist. Yeah. And that's one of the things for me that's at the crux of the conversation that we have. So much of racism and morality are linked, like, oh my goodness, but they're so nice, but they donated to their local church. How can they be racist? And we exclude this conversation of this American system, this system that was put into play in slavery and never eradicated, just adjusted, just realigned. And so there's never this introduction of a fair system of equality. We just keep tweaking this old system so that it doesn't seem as heinous as the last iteration. I think one of the biggest things that are changing about right now is social media. Because these things were happening in the 80s. These things were happening in the 70s and the 60s, in every decade in this country. But now there are cameras watching and you can't avoid it. Now, when George Floyd, when the death of George Floyd occurs, you have video that I haven't watched to this day, but we have the video. When Amy Cooper responds, wielding her white privilege as a weapon, we now have the documentation, because Black voices alone were not enough to convince you. And so now there is this kind of avoidance of reality that can no longer occur. And it's like, oh my God, it's everywhere. It's always been everywhere. You just now have the veil of ignorance lifted.
Yes, so it's interesting. I think about this a lot because when we see, especially Black people die at the hands of police or at the hands of private citizens or anything, something that I think about a lot is the public response. A lot of times I find that white people are surprised and Black and brown people are just tired because this is reality. This is reality for non-white people. This is what we deal with. A lot of times, like I said, white people are outraged because this isn't something that they're dealing with on a daily basis. They don't have the same thoughts about how am I dressing, how am I looking when I'm driving or walking down the street, or when I see that cop car or go into the store oh wait, I put my hands in my pocket. It's not part of everyday reality, and it's something that's not considered, and it's something that needs to be considered. Part of it is also the way that we teach history in schools. As Mark mentioned earlier, you mentioned the burning of what's referred to as the burning of Black Wall Street, or the Tulsa race riots in 1921. We had hundreds of people die in a single day by a lynch mob. And I can guarantee you that 90% of people have never even heard of it because it's mentioned almost nowhere in public education.
Unless you watch HBO's Watchmen. How many people was HBO's Watchmen the first time you understood about this massacre in American history?
It was me, and I have to tell you, it was unbelievable to me that was the realization, that I had to wait for a fictional comic book-based HBO show that was the furthest thing from reality and yet was the closest thing to reality that I have seen. And I could not believe it. It struck me to the core, to the absolute core, because that, I guarantee you, Andrina, is exactly correct, that the only people that probably have any awareness of it whatsoever are because of a TV show that came out in 2020, which guarantees you that it has never been a part of the curriculum at any level in American history in this country up until this point. God willing, it will be going forward. But I have to make it very much in the I am exactly the person that you just described.
How many of you have heard of the Elaine Massacre?
I have.
You have?
I have not.
This occurred in eastern Arkansas, where a group of Black farmers decided to market their own cotton. The sheriff came to break up their meetings, and there was a shootout. Several law enforcement officers were killed. And in response, there were mass murders of over 200 Black families. Just as many people were killed in eastern Arkansas in the Elaine Massacre as in the destruction of Black Wall Street. And this is even less well known.
Right.
So I'm a historian. I've been doing this for 50 years, and I'm learning things in the last 5 years, which I didn't know, which are changing my view of slavery and race. And this is getting to our students, and it's changing them. It's making, as Andrina said, this has been going on forever. It's never been taught, it's never been understood, it's never been dealt with.
And it's also rarely framed outside of the white perspective. I think when we analyze why this is something that has been shielded for so many years, let's talk about how the majority of historians, of anthropologists in this country are white males. Let's talk about the reason why we haven't seen things like Tulsa featured the way that it did is because Black stories weren't important enough to be centered. I spoke about it in a previous panel that I went to. I am both Native American and African American, and a plus size woman. I am 5'11". You can't tell because I'm on a little Zoom box, but I am not tiny by any means. And I attended a musical theater college where they just didn't know what to do with me. You know, Hamilton hadn't hit the Great White Way yet. So there was Aida, who was a slave, who then was a Namibian queen, but I was plus size and I wasn't fitting into this narrow structure. And so when we only have a handful of stories gaining importance or relevance in our history, then we are turning ourselves into one-dimensional people. Like, I am the well-rounded person that I am because of all of the experiences I was exposed to. And when we shelter and segregate and remain in white communities with our white friends and our white systems, then you don't see what you're missing out for your personal growth, because your limitation is that with which you are comfortable, and the uncomfortable is where we experience the most growth.
Yeah, Andrina, I actually grew up in theater myself, and I can tell you that within the theater community, I can't even tell you the amount of times that I was barred from auditions because it was listed as Caucasian only. There were almost never parts that really fit my description. And like you said, that largely stems from the fact that we don't tell these stories. Mark, I don't know if you went into the burning of Black Wall Street. In case, just very, very quickly, in case anyone it doesn't know and is curious. In 1921 in Tulsa, there was a community of Black-owned businesses that were thriving, and it was known as Black Wall Street because it was so successful. At the same time, I believe a 17-year-old male entered the elevator with a white woman. There's not detailed descriptions of what happened because of what happened after, but a minute later, the white woman screams and later accuses the Black man of sexual assault. A little bit later, when this hits, when people start to find out about this, a lynch mob shows up at Black Wall Street, drags people out of businesses and homes, starts killing and beating people, and burns Black Wall Street to the ground. And burns Black Wall Street to the ground. And it again killed, I believe, between 200 and 300 people. And this is never taught in schools. This was a massacre of hundreds, and we never talk about this. Has anyone else on this panel ever heard of Seneca Village?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Only recently. Right.
So this type of thing you would think was taught in schools. Central Park where Central Park is currently, it used to be a Black community called Seneca Village in the 1800s. So escaped slaves were coming to New York to try to build lives, and they built a community. And then New York State showed up and said, hey, this is ours now, took it through eminent domain, bulldozed it, and made it Central Park. And part of the reason that I'm bringing this up is because these conversations are extremely and unequivocally important to understanding what people are going through in a modern day setting. A lot of times when events happen, we hear things like, what about Black and Black crime? Or we hear disgusting things about perceived behavior of Black and brown people, or about communities. The United States has put us into this. Every time Black people have ever gotten a leg up, it's been torn down almost immediately. And
all of our leaders have been assassinated. All of our leaders. I'm so sorry, Skyler. I just wanted to, how can we build off of a previous legacy when that legacy has been demolished? Yes. It's like you're reinventing the wheel each time.
Yes. Ida B. Wells, who was the greatest, critic and exposer of lynching, said that a significant number of lynchings were targeting successful Blacks. That the most dangerous possible thing to be in the United States of America, especially in the South, in the 1890s and early 20th century, was to be a successful, educated, property-owning Black person.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to say before you go on, look how successful Black people are treated today. A Black president's elected, and before he's even elected, they start saying, well, he wasn't born in America. And now we get a Black woman put onto the presidential ticket. Well, she's not eligible to be president because her parents are not from the United States. I have never seen anyone say, hey, maybe George Bush was actually born in Europe, or maybe Donald Trump's from Sweden. They only ever target Black leaders. So yeah, definitely, Mark, it was always dangerous to be a Black person in the 1800s, and we still see it now because successful Black people are not understood and are treated as an enemy by the general public. They're seen as an anomaly. They're seen as an anomaly or an exception, and people look to try to take them down on basis of race.
And what I have had to do, kind of tacking that on as an existence, is growing up in the communities that I grew up in, I had to make sure that my energy was big enough to trick you so that you forgot I had melanin in my skin. So then when I would enter in white spaces, I had to make sure that all of the white people felt comfortable, because I'm a large brown woman and I don't want to scare you. And that is exhausting. constantly having to mold myself to make other people feel better. When Trump got elected, and so many people who I loved, so many and still love, voted for him, recognizing that their personal self-interest in this game would benefit from him. And it didn't matter seeing the cost for other people. Like, preservation of their livelihood comes before the humane treatment of people of color. And so as long as we continue to hold true to this economic system that benefits white and white presenting people far more than it does people of color, there's going to be no change, because we can kumbaya all we want to, but if the economics of the world is still directed as it is, there's going to be no change.
Yeah, when I first started running for state senate around November, I was
That's such a cool sentence. I'm so sorry. When I first started running for state senate, so sorry, keep going.
No, I appreciate it. I hope I was able to connect with a lot of people throughout the campaign, and I hopefully inspired people. And that's one of the most important things I think I did, and I really appreciate that. So when I first started running back in November, I was making a lot of calls to voters throughout the district, and I called someone in Southampton, and it was this woman in her 70s, and we were having a really, really lovely conversation. And towards the end of the conversation, she asked me about my background. She asked me about my family, and I ended up describing where my family was from. And a minute later, she went, "Oh, that's funny. I thought you sounded white." And that's first of all, it's not funny. A lot of people think that that's a joke. Multiple members of my family have experienced it. A lot of family friends that are Black have experienced it, with people being told that they sound white, or that they're a white Black person. Whatever the latest phrases.
The Oreos,
yes.
Apples,
Yes.
It's usually fruits, bananas. That's fascinating.
Right.
Sorry, continue.
No, but exactly. First of all, that goes down to dehumanization of Black people, and that becomes a whole nother issue. But even just with this one phrase, as Andrina said, we need to conform to certain standards of a white society. This wasn't built for us. This was built for the other. We're all trying now to just catch up and trying to find our place in a society that is not meant for us, a society that was not built for us. Long Island is one of the most segregated places in the country. I believe Suffolk rates as the 10th most segregated county in the country. Part of the reason for that is because it was designed that way. Well, the main reason for that is because it was designed that way. Robert Moses, as he was designing the infrastructure of the island, built it to make sure that minorities were not coming out here. So when people that look like me, that look like Andrina, are trying to build lives here, it's more difficult than our white counterparts, because this was not built for us. We are built around infrastructure that was designed for someone that does not look like us, and was in fact designed to try to prevent us from staying here. It's not just that it wasn't built for us, it was designed to try to make us leave. That's a whole nother level when you really consider it. It was designed to make sure we didn't think about coming here, we didn't come here, and if we did come here, that we left as soon as possible. The island was built that way. And it's disgusting when you consider it, but it's still prevalent in a modern day setting. We saw the redlining of the 1930s and 40s with the New Deal, that decimated minority communities and made it impossible for advancement. We've seen all these policies throughout the years that are not actually improving. I said earlier that when Black people are killed at the hands of police, that white people are shocked, Black people are tired. When the Long Island Divided piece came out of Newsday exposing the racism within the housing system, again, white people were shocked, Black people were tired. We knew that already. We knew that we were not getting the same treatment when we went to realtors. We knew that we were being put into communities that were not the same as our white counterparts. I grew up in a town called Mount Sinai in Brookhaven that was about 93% white when we first moved there. It's still around that level. We were not supposed to be there. We were not supposed to live there. That was not designed for us. And that's how it is. It's not surprising for the Black communities, because this place was not built for us, and it's not meant for us, and we're not changing that still.
So
and the racism. Oh, so sorry, Dan.
No, please.
And I was just going to tack on to bring it full circle. And the racism of Long Island is not limited to the Black community. Too, I mean, in Mein Kampf, Hitler shouts out the scientist from Cold Spring Harbor who started eugenics. Like, that started on Long Island. This entire scientific theory, which was the basis and foundation, was started on Long Island. Sunset towns existed. And this was, like, as Skyler said, this was the foundation for which we have currently grown our garden. Rabbi Dan, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, you have nothing to, I appreciate exactly what you said. And I was only just going to say and really ask this question, because I think both of you have identified the fact that you're growing up in environments in which you are not seeing in your classrooms, in your teachers, in your school books, anything even resembling positive Black culture, Black history. Let's broaden it further out, that BIOPC, history, culture. How did you go about then forming the identities that you both clearly so authentically and so genuinely have embraced and been able to now live and to teach? But what was it like for you growing up in an environment where you weren't seeing that around you? How did you not the right word, how did you create the experiences for yourselves that didn't get created for you? If that makes sense.
I mean, it's not as effortless as I made it look. In fact, for a really long time, I had swallowed the Kool-Aid. Like, before my high school did not talk about the Atlantic slave trade in it. So there was no slavery. I can talk to you about ancient Mesopotamia, or I can drop chiaroscuro in conversation when referring to Renaissance art, but the understanding of the Atlantic slave trade was not something that my high school focused on. So that time for me was spent learning how to stay afloat in a white world. And I did a stand-up set at LTV for the, oh my goodness, I can't think of the name, for the breast cancer amazing woman. Yes, thank you so much. Ellen Herman Foundation. And I did a comedy night. And one of the things that I was saying is, like, you know, whenever I talk about the Hamptons and I'm from here, they want to hear what it was like they want to experience this, like, get out the Hamptons version. And for me, it wasn't like that, because the white people who I grew up around embraced me. So many opportunities that I had came from families who fully embraced me, and I'm not going to deny their role and participation in my upbringing. But for so many of those families, I was the only person of color who was allowed to cross the threshold. I would walk into these parties, into these events, into these country clubs, and the only other people of color were their help. And this was my foundation for so many years. And then I went to Emerson College, which too was a very white program. And then I moved to the Czech Republic. So in terms of identity, I had constantly been the other, so much so that there became times where it was hard for me to, it was easier for me to navigate around white spaces than Black spaces. And that was a problem. And I didn't realize the internalized kind of hatred that I had developed and absorbed from seeing this kind of silent racism, not be, oh no, like, get the coon, where they're not this, like, overly aggressive kind of racism, but this, you know, we don't really talk about that. That's not really, I mean, I get it, but, like, come on, we're having, like, polite conversation. No, it's not. Okay, oh, my bad, I'm so sorry. In an avoidance to be this kind of rage-filled, frustrated person that I had every right to be. And I worked for a lot of families out here as a tutor, as an educator, and I saw the bad side of wealth. I saw the negative side of what wealth could do. And then I realized I couldn't be a part of it any longer. And so then from 25 to like 30 31 was really like this re-education process of dismantling the system of which I said this when we were in our meeting last week. I did not get to take the class on white privilege. I didn't get to register for it, but I got to audit it. And I got to see the behind the scenes and pull behind the curtain Wizard of Oz style. And now I'm using the language of the oppressor to combat that oppression. And I'm just so grateful that the authority over my words and the ability to, to tell the stories of those that came before me is with me, because for so many people, they are not able to stand in front of all white rooms, in front of all white audiences, and speak that visceral truth, because sometimes it's really hard. And it's really intimidating when people don't want to listen and want to completely refute your perspective, despite the fact that they have never walked a mile in your shoes or even down the path that you've been walking down. And sometimes just my life is spent declaring very vehemently on Facebook. My friends around Trump, when he got nominated, they noticed I took a real swerve for the angry. Like, all of my Facebook posts were real. Like, there was no holding back. And then the movement happened. And then this year happened. And I realized I can't hold space for white people in the way that I have, because my communities need me. And if I can, in that journey, help that development, yes. But now my focus needs to be on the communities of color, on the children from the reservation who are constantly excluded and constantly ridiculed. For the Hill in Southampton, which is the last Black community, rapidly eroding and nothing being done for it. So to make a very long monologue short, sorry guys, all of the theaters are closed, so I have to get my monologues out where I can. It's all kind of come down to now this culmination where this is my truth. This is the truth that I, as a beacon of creator's light, am going to manifest, because I don't know what the outcome of this is going to look like. I do not know what the end of this road is going to look like, because there is a very real chance that we are not successful. But I know I gotta meet my maker. And I know I'm going to have that conversation with God, knowing that if I did not do everything in my power to make that change, then what's up? One of the things that I love the most about the Jewish faith is this Day of Atonement. Like, go check your stuff. Do you have some things in your closet that you gotta tell God about? So like, while I don't have that day, that kind of like leads me, like checking in with Creator, be like, all right, Creator, I did this, I gotta do this, because that's the one thing that I can control, that connection to that light and that manifestation, or that desire to manifest that out a little further.
I love it. And Andrina, I appreciate the referential piece. You know, Yom Kippur is a very interesting experience. I will welcome you guys if you'd ever like to join. We'll run you through the paces. But one of the things that I always found really fascinating about it is that in our prayers in Hebrew, especially on the Day of Atonement, they are written in the plural. They are generally speaking not written in the individual form. In other words, we do what's called basically the word in English would be a confessional, in which collectively each of us is meant basically to beat our chest and understand, not in pain, right, not in anger, but in waking ourselves up to realize that we are both individually responsible, but collectively responsible as well. So that when we make atonement, it's not if I do it and the guy next to me doesn't do it, we're all okay. If we don't take it seriously collectively, then nothing can ever really truly change. And unfortunately, I will just say the efficacy of Yom Kippur in terms of long-term change is still, still limited. Every year we have to come back to it, and every year we have to really hold the mirror up and try to understand, where our failings are. And so I really appreciate the sincerity with which you offered, and you certainly never have to apologize about a long answer or a detailed answer or an emotional answer, because those are all things that we really appreciate. And Skyler, I was just curious, I know, take the question wherever you would like to go, but of course, knowing also that part of your identity and part of your background is Jewish, I'm just curious, to know whether you felt more acutely in one direction or the other growing up in Mount Sinai, ironically in Mount Sinai of all places, right? Did you feel that you ever were being more identified as one or the other without your control? Or was that something that you were able to determine for yourself and to share with others that they would then understand and represent and respect?
So I'll answer that part of the question first, because it's interesting you said that. I have literally never been able to determine my own identity. No one has ever asked. It's picked for me. It was decided for me, not only at birth, but it's decided for me every day. People decide my skin color. People decide my religion. People decide my own identity without my consent. I have literally no control over the way my identity is perceived. It will always be perceived by literally every person I meet differently. I've had professors be shocked that I was Jewish because I don't look like it and my last name doesn't sound like it. I've had people all over be again very, very surprised that I was not a Christian or a Catholic. When I was in 8th grade, I wore a yarmulke for a day just to see what happened, and I got pulled out of a class by an aide to ask if I was joking around, if I was pulling a prank. That's what it was like growing up as a Jew in my area but people decided that I wasn't Jewish or that I didn't look Jewish. More recently, actually, there was a statement that was made by Mayor de Blasio of New York City that targeted the Hasidic community, and I was very not happy with the way it was phrased, because it was supposed to talk about following social distancing guidelines, but it was put in a very authoritarian and very discriminatory way. And something I called it on Twitter was the fact that it was extremely harmful to the Jewish community, because it paints them as targets, it paints them as outsiders, it paints them as enemies. And I actually had someone respond and tell me that I was pretending to be Jewish. And then when I talked about my identity, they said, oh, then you actually changed your last name to make yourself sound less Jewish so that way people wouldn't know. And it was kind of a surreal experience, because I don't even know how to combat that. I don't even know where to start with how stupid that argument is. But it really wasn't that surprising when I actually consider what people have probably been thinking my entire life. This guy just said the quiet part out loud. When I was in kindergarten, I came home from my kindergarten class and told my mom that I wished I was white, because I was the only non-white kid in my class. So this has been a part of my life since literally before I can remember. I never grew up with people that looked like me. I never grew up with role models that looked like me, people in the media that looked like me, people in anything that looked like me. I remember that it actually got to the point where if we traveled outside of New York, especially if we went to a place like Washington, D.C., which has a lot more minority communities, I was always shocked by the amount of minorities that I saw there, because I didn't grow up around that. I grew up being the only one. I grew up being the person who looked different in my classroom. I grew up being the person who had the weird religious background, and who had never been baptized, and who wasn't sharing these experiences. I did not grow up in an area where I was chatting with other people who had just come from their bar mitzvah. That wasn't something that was done. And it's exhausting after a while, because I had no room to shape my own identity, because again, it was decided for me by the people around me. And it was done throughout the campaign, where I see people trying to frame me based on their perception of myself, and it's exhausting after a while. It's something that I still deal with to this day. It's something that I deal with every time I leave the house. In high school, for me, it kind of manifested in me becoming very, very, very politically outspoken, as I'm sure that shocks you based on what I did later. But I was very, very politically outspoken in high school. I was always talking about the Democratic side of things, and I dealt with people who were very obviously white supremacists, even if I didn't realize it at the time. With a guy who I later found out thought that gay people should be in conversion therapy, and had all of these negative thoughts about Black communities. Was always making Islamophobic comments. So I was dealing with that a lot. And the other thing that I kind of saw with it was the people who thought that was funny, who thought that these were just jokes. I was always told, if someone made a Holocaust joke, just to lighten up, that, it's just a joke, it's just humor. If someone made a joke about the Black community, you know, again, it's just a joke. Why do you think
you can't take a joke? Yeah, come on, I'm just being funny. Yeah,
Exactly.
I did comedy in the city. Oh yeah.
Right,
Sorry.
exactly. That's exactly right. And I can imagine that you saw that more than anywhere in New York in New York City comedy, because that's exactly how we're told. You can't take a joke. You're right, Andrina, because it's always on us. It's always on us to need to better ourselves in the way of understanding how we are not perceiving their intentions. You know, they're trying to be funny, not they're saying something that's extremely prejudiced and extremely harmful. And again, one more time, it's exhausting after a while, because people that look like me, people that look like Andrina, are always going around having to guard our own identities because it's being decided for us. My mom's side of the family is Russian. They're Polish, they're Austrian, they're from Europe, they're white. My dad's side of the family is from South America. And by the way, just very quickly with that, I'm always being told, first of all, that, you know, my family's from Africa. If I say my family's from Guyana, oh, is that in Africa? Apparently we're African American. We're South American doesn't even register on it, because people in the United States kind of associate South American with purely Hispanic. Anyone from South America.
Oh yeah, because there can be Black South Americans. Those don't exist. That's
absolutely not.
Another conversation too.
Right. Exactly. That could never happen. There is no Black people anywhere in the world other than Africa. Maybe.
Yeah.
No. Yes, that's exactly how we're treated. My grandparents are literally from Guyana. They moved to New York when they were in their early 20s. They're it's not even like their ancestry is Guyanese. They're literally from Guyana, and yet they're treated as if they don't exist because their country is not somewhere in Africa. And
so sorry.
No.
I just wanted to interrupt. It's funny because I know that if I ever walked into an audition room for a role of a Native woman, I would be looked at like, what? Like, if I don't come decked out in tribal wear and tribal gear, it's like,
wow.
But you're Black. And this idea of Native culture being canceled out when Black blood is present is something that has historically been used to disenfranchise Native lands and Native properties, because the natives who blended with whites in like Oklahoma, upstate New York, like they're not the problem. It's the ones who are with the darkies that we have issue with. And it's something, even being Native American now, people don't understand that there are 573 federally recognized nations. So it's not that there are different races. These are individual nations with their own cultural practices, with their own social identities. I identify as Shinnecock because sometimes it is still too hard for me with the racism that I encounter to say, I'm Native American. I always have to tack on, and Black, that's why I'm dark, because I heard you thinking it. And it's exhausting. It is so exhausting. And the limitation of boxes that we've been placed in terms of identity is part of the structural problem. Literally, in the census box, if to this day, if you do Native American and another identity, then you are seen as multicultural, and the money is for your Native community. Do not go there. I am a descendant of, I can trace my legacy back. Right now, I can go back 12 generations. I can document 10 of them. So it's like, I am the storyteller of my ancestors. Quashawam, who was a native chief's daughter. She was the daughter of Wyandanch. Because of her, the Shinnecock Nation is still prevalent and still exists. But in the 1600s, while the Dutch were in New Amsterdam, the English were on the east end of Long Island trying to encroach on territories that belonged to natives. So what Quashawam did is she went to New Amsterdam and was like, hey, just so you know, the English are out here and they're plotting But the Dutch were like, you squaw woman, get out of here. And then the English attacked the Dutch, and everything that we see unfold as now New York. And the reason that I'm saying this is because it is important for me to do the historical work so that the legacy and importance, the historical relevance of the East End of Long Island is explored, is told. On Sylvester Manor, they found this piece of pottery that was shaped by a Native woman, had the designs of a West African slave and the spout of a European indentured servant. And this piece of history, which represents this monolith that is the East End still, this kind of working class white, was and is slowly eroding, but working class white, Native presence, Black presence is so beautiful and underspoken, because weaving it back, Black stories haven't mattered enough to the narrative. And because of that, we are exposing this one-sided existence, which serves none of us.
No, and I think, it's, as it happens, our previous presentation really was talking about specifically, the history on the East End, of course, which was history that most of us on the call, myself included, had never heard and never would have even had access to hear. And I think that as both of you talk so powerfully about the realities of not being given the opportunity to identify yourselves, right, to create your own identity, and for others to be able to see and acknowledge and respect the unique identities that each of you possess and the many, many others who are like you possess. The question I guess I would have is, both of you grew up in your neighborhoods out here, your schools out here, and realizing that a lot of identity formation takes place in our education, right? It certainly takes place in our homes, but the reality is when we go into school, that is where a lot of our sense of who we are ultimately is formed. And if the schools aren't teaching the stories of the real stories, right? The stories of all of us, are you doing anything, or can you do anything? And really I'll extend it, can we do anything to be able to try to help the educational system, private and public, to be able to approach the next generation, right? We may not be able to go back and to change your experiences as children or our generation's experiences as children, but what, if anything, are you two involved in the educational sphere, either where you guys grew up or elsewhere, where you think that you're making some inroads, or where you hope to make some inroads in trying to change this reality?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things for me, and it's funny because, oh my gosh, guys, it's my birthday tomorrow. I'm going to be 35.
Happy birthday.
I'm very excited. Oh my gosh, thank you. And so, yeah, it's weird. Today is my mom's birthday.
Happy birthday.
But I definitely will let her know. But being the person that I am, I was like, no, I need my own birthday, and was in labor, and she was in labor for 32 hours because we were supposed to have the same birthday.
That was my first thought, is but continue.
It was, and I was like, no, I need my own day, thanks. But the reason I say this is because I am 15 years older than Skyler, and I am firmly a millennial because of how much people crapped on millennials. And I feel like so many of the doors that I got to walk through instantly shut behind me, and behind that, the erosion of so many pillars of society went with it. And so the youth have been my focus since forever. I've been working with children since I was 14 years old. And one of the things that Mark was saying before, which I find so true, is that this movement is about the youth. And I am, at my age, I did not ruin the world. I am a part of the, it's funny, I'm a part of that generation where they were like, you guys all got the medals of participation just for showing up. And I'm like, guys, I wasn't a teacher or an administrator. I didn't make those rules. Why are you harping on our generation? And the reason, just to wrap it up, the reason I bring that in is because I think that it's so important to be a beacon for the next generation. Right now, I'm working just a small thing. I'm doing a GoFundMe for the children from the reservation who graduated under COVID, because so many of the monies that I received post-graduating came from graduation parties, and they can't have this. And I want to be able to give them something to let them know that they are cared for, that they're nurtured. In Bridgehampton, there's a Zenith Project, which my friend Willie Jenkins is starting, which is a program that's going to be working on fiscal responsibility for our youth, on job employment for our youth, on teaching people how to be more than the limitations of our system is providing them with. There are so many opportunities for internships, for job placement that go to nepotistic connections. And if you don't have, and I know this because if I'm being honest, the majority of my successes came from my Hamptons connections, not college. They came from my East Hampton Raw School connections. And if you don't have access to those worlds, then you're not going to get those connections. And that gap is only becoming wider. So the Zenith Project is something that's trying to realign and recenter Black history and Black focused, a Black focus on our youth, because so many of our children in disparate communities are lacking that connection. I did the show Africaville, and I cast 2 girls in a role that my team originally wanted to be adults, but one of the students who was 13 left the school that she was attending because someone carved nigger into one of the tables, and then someone caused a swastika, and she was constantly enduring microaggressions. And so I wanted to give her a role in this project so she can feel empowered, so we can have conversations around race with people who looked like her. Something that we can do is there is nothing that connects the children from the different school districts. There's no program that can unify them. And the only reason is because it hasn't been asked of our school district boards. You know, there are things that we can demand in our local schools. That school that I was speaking of, I was working with a Black Alumni Alliance on the East End that we're trying to make go national, where all Black alumni can come together and help serve as mentors, as offer opportunities for other Black enterprises and people, because those things don't exist currently. And so that's just, I think I wrote one more down. Oh yeah, and then another thing, like Bridgehampton Day is an opportunity for, or Juneteenth also in Southampton. These are things like my mother did the Juneteenth program, and she also did the George Floyd Vigil. And it's funny because the only reason I think so much has unfolded for me for this is because my mom's like, I'm having this George Floyd Vigil and you have to speak. And I'm like, what? And she's like, you have to. So I'm like, how many other activists are doing activist work because their mom made them? But I'm very happy and proud that she did, because this is a very unique time. This is a very unique time for our country, but especially a unique time for the East End. And we have an opportunity here to turn around and do the same thing that we have been doing, or to confront our problems face first, you know, really head on. And that's what I'm interested in doing. And all of the work that I put out continues with that philosophy.
Fantastic. And Skyler, I was wondering, you know, and Mark also, I would love to get your insight as well. But just thinking, especially given your experience very recently in the political realm, you know, obviously one can feel a little despondent sometimes when you get involved in politics and it feels like you are doing everything right and yet no change takes place. But in your experience, right, you're starting this experience at 20 years old to run for state senate to try to make that kind of impact. Do you find that there are others like you from within the larger BIOPC communities that are now sort of seeing the opportunities in politics? I hope there are opportunities in politics, but how to support getting more minority voices onto tickets, getting into the legislative process in order to have an effect also on the educational system, as a result of it, because we often know that even if you have a well-intentioned meeting with the principal, that unless the superintendent and unless those above the superintendent are funding it and supporting it, that ultimately nothing is likely to change. So I'm just wondering, since Skyler, you had this experience so recently, do you see any openings there in New York State? Do you see opportunities, or is it all, gloomy in terms of the outlook?
So no, I definitely see opportunities, and it's partially because of the Black Lives Matter movement, because we've seen such a surge of marches and protests across the state and across the island. It's giving young minority activists a platform, a lot of them for the first time. There's a lot of people around my age that are minorities that I kind of approached after, and I'm like, so have you ever considered a run for public office? Because it was one of their first speaking engagements, but they were brilliant at it, and they were engaged, and they were smart, and they knew the issues. But they never considered it because of the same issues that any minority person faces when they run, and the same issues that any young person faces when they run. So I believe that there is an opening. If you want to look at who's influencing people the most, just look at who's being attacked. We see that with AOC a lot in the city. She's a younger Latina woman, and she's always being attacked. She's always being torn apart. Go back to where you.
But her clap back is so good.
Very good.
It's so real every
good.
time. But
she would be good at the improv, by the way. I feel like she would be excellent.
Her zingers be like, I'm like, hey, OC. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. And you're right. And it's funny because she's really, really good at pushing back. But unfortunately, not everyone's that good at pushing back, and it's part of the reason they don't get involved, because they can't. They shouldn't have to deal with the constant. She's always being attacked in racist manners. If you actually watch what's happening, she's being held to a higher standard than her white counterparts would be. And it's also an attack on the working class aspect of it, where if you look at the attacks on her, well, she was just a bartender before she ran for Congress. That's what Congress should be. Congress shouldn't just be a ruling class type of system. It should be coming from people from all walks of life, from all levels of experience, from all backgrounds, to bring together a real assembly for the people. But one thing I do want to bring up with this, with your earlier question, the public education system is inherently racist as it's currently built. I talked about redlining earlier. That is so prevalent in education. Schools are funded primarily through property tax. That's a problem, because that means that if you live in a white town versus a black town, the white people are most likely getting a better education than the counterparts because of the town that they live in. It's a significant problem that is very common, is almost universal, in fact, right now. The property tax as the primary funding source of schools needs to go. We see that a lot on the island, where we see the schools that have the highest minority bases are generally not the schools that have the highest amount of resources. They generally have the lowest amount of resources. They generally are the worst funded. They generally have the highest budget gaps. They generally have the lowest paid teachers. I've seen there are schools on the island that are actually being cited for how much money they have left in their budget, next to schools that are struggling just to get their kids' textbooks. And that mostly affects minority students. It affects white students too, but it heavily affects minority students, and it is not recognized. So the school system is racist to begin with. It affects indigenous students. It affects any black or brown students overall, because the schools that they attend are most likely not of the same quality of their white counterparts. We talk about education as a great equalizer, but it's not, because if you're starting off with a lesser standing than your white counterpart, then you are not getting the same education. You're not getting the same opportunity. This is going to be even more important actually this year, because we have schools going online. White communities have statistically more access to technology than their minority counterparts, which means that this year more than any, minority students are not going to be getting the same quality of education. But even if everything was completely normal, even if everything was completely the same, as technology develops, we're going to see the white schools installing more and more technology, smart boards and any other and smartboards, giving their students laptops, anything that students might need to succeed, and the minority students falling behind as they cannot afford this because their communities have been decimated by these policies that are keeping them from being able to fund their schools in the same manner. So that part of education is extremely racist because it is designed to benefit the white students and not the black students or any other minority, and it's something that's not talked about enough because it's something that is such a basis of American society. We tend to see things here as it's always been done this way, therefore it's the way it needs to be done. Most people are really, really surprised when I bring up the property tax issue because it's not something that we even consider because it's just another that's how it's always done type of thing. But it's done that way because it benefits a very select group of people, and it's going to continue to benefit that select group of people if we do that. Changing property tax to a tax across New York would not only benefit minority communities, it would actually benefit everybody because it would allow us to tax 1%ers, it would allow us to tax the rich, and then put that money into our public schools equally instead of having schools that literally have money left over in their budget next to schools that cannot afford to buy their kids pencils. It's insane what we're doing. It's also a problem for our teachers, where we have teachers that are literally working second jobs to try to stay afloat. Those teachers are supposed to be available for extra help if they have a second job at the end of the day, or if they need to have paid tutoring because they cannot afford to feed their family. If they don't, it is not going to happen. So if we do this, if we change our funding to focus on all schools, if we change our funding away from this historically racist system, it will benefit all students, but especially minority students.
Thank you for that. I think really, as a lot of us are experiencing, that the world of the things that we take for granted or that we just assume, as you said, right, because it's always functioned this way, therefore it will continue to function this way, and it should continue to function this way, that eventually affects every single aspect of society, right? That's one of the things that I think has been the most eye-opening about each of our conversations in this series and conversations that have been going on aside from it, is just realizing again how each and every layer and element of our culture and our society is affected by this basic principle upon which everything else has been built. And so one of the challenges I think that a lot of people are feeling, and I hear from everybody, as we have these sessions, we walk away and we want to sort of know what to go out and to be able to do. And I know that everybody wants to know that because we all want to have a task list, right? Here are the 5 things to go in and do, and then we'll change the world. But I think that part of what we are realizing increasingly that it's not that simple. It doesn't mean that there aren't things for us to do, but Skyler, your example is really very key, which is that unless we get voices in the legislatures, unless we get voices on the campaign trails, unless we get voices out in the streets that are bringing these conversations to the fore, whereas Andrina, I think, was just pointing out, her experience growing up, we don't talk about that at the dinner table, right? We don't talk about that right now. That's not the time to have this conversation. That is the easiest place for those of us that don't want to talk about something to go and hide, right? It's just very easy to say now is not a convenient time. And I think that what we all realize is that is a convenient rationalization and excuse that allows for the continuation of all the challenges that the two of you experienced growing up. So I really appreciate both perspectives, right? Andrina, through your work in the culture and theater and comedy and storytelling. Skyler, your work in the field of politics. Mark, your field in education. And then all of you are trying as best as you can to change the conversation, to change the narrative, and to do even things like what we are doing tonight. And why we appreciate it so much is being able to really begin conversations, but we have to, to take the next step after that. Mark, I know I cut you off earlier, and I know that we're getting a little close to our an hour and a half, and I don't want to steal any more time. I want to make sure that each of you will have the last word. I do want to just say, though, before I forget, that one of our first presenters, Dr. James Banks, asked if he could get your contact information for all 3 of you. He's been doing some remarkable work and would like to. So, Dr. Banks, if you're listening still, I will make sure that we make those connections as well. But Mark, why don't you jump in? I know that you've been purposely trying to give some space, but it would be very interesting to hear your perspective on this.
I had an interesting experience in Fordham about 4 years ago. We had some terrible racial incidents, and a huge student movement arose. And a group of students came to me and said, Nason, you need to teach a new course on the Bronx because there's so much negativity towards the community among all these, white suburban kids coming into the Bronx, and it feeds into racist attitudes to the students of color. So in 3 weeks, I asked my community contacts and student contacts, help me create a course. We created a course, and I've been teaching it. You know, this is my 4th year teaching it. I think this needs to be done in the schools out here. There need to be courses on African American. And I think you can find teachers at every school who would be willing to do this, and to coordinate and to connect them with the scholars at the universities. Because I can tell you, there are young scholars at every university uncovering all this hidden history we need to know. The next step is to translate it into something that every young person going to school here is exposed to. And the way to do that is to find the teachers who could teach it and then push it through the school board after they create it. That's something that, you know, I think people who know their local schools know who the teachers are who would be receptive to that. Every public school, every private school, every Catholic school out here should be teaching the African American and indigenous history of Suffolk County. And that's something that could actually happen. So I think that's one thing that I would say, but I also want to kick into what Skyler said. Several of my students at Fordham have won elections that they were supposed to lose to the New York State Senate and have transformed that body into a very different body. Somebody who I worked closely in the Bronx, a great innovative principal, Jamal Bowman, just got elected to Congress. There are young people who are doing exactly what Skyler said, and but you have to combine that with the grassroots pressure in institutions. You know, you have to, you know, like I was put up against the wall. Nason, you've got to do this. Ms. Jones, you've got to teach this course. And, you know, the combination of the political organizing and electing, you know, new voices to office, but you have to, you know, approach institutions and say, you need to do this so that young people here will know their history and won't grow up with this sense of, you know, who am I? And why is people who look like me, people with my background, seem to be always looked on as secondary. And that, I'm convinced you could do that. But it would take a coordinated effort in each community connecting to the scholars who know this. Yeah. So that's my practical suggestion. Every school, and high school certainly should have that kind of course.
So I think what's interesting actually is, as all of you talked about, because I want to bring this back knowing that all three of you, and certainly Andrina and Skyler in our neck of the woods, I've been particularly involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and as it is, right, it's not obviously for you guys starting a week ago or a month ago like it has for many of us. But in your experience, you know, where do you see the intersection between the change that we have identified that needs to happen and the movement as it stands today? Because I know one of the challenges of a decentralized movement sometimes is how do we now take the ideas and make them reality? Right? If there is a different group in each area, how is there any kind of cohesion? So the question is, I guess, for you guys, since you've been on the ground, you are the activists, you are helping to lead the protests. How do we transfer the energy that is in the streets to the kind of change that I think each of you has articulated for us tonight? And how, ultimately speaking, can we, certainly I can only speak for our Temple community, but I think for many people who are on this call tonight who want to get involved, but they're not quite sure how, and they're not quite sure what their voice is going to do and how best to lend it, and in particular, how not to do what oftentimes is the case and overtake the other voices. In other words, try to co-opt a movement that is not ours. How can we be supportive and yet at the same time not be trying to steer the conversation towards where we think it ought to go? I hope that question makes sense.
No. In my George Floyd, when I spoke at the vigil, one of the things that I said was so many people have been asking me, how can I get this right? And that's beautiful. But are you prepared to get this wrong? Because you're going to get this wrong. because the way the system has been designed, it's been designed for you to not see the pain and plight of Black lives. Simultaneously, this system has consistently not put Black lives at the forefront. So there are so many people who, yes, have been doing so much hard work, but in terms of being able to apply it to the structures of the East End, it is something that is still a work in progress. So simultaneously, I'm going to have to ask you to have patience, because so frequently what I see happen sometimes is like, oh, well, I came to this and oh, they weren't together, so this means that. No, this means that this is the first time we are having the opportunity to take the stage. Because when you have hundreds of years of being silent and finally the microphone is on you, I mean, granted, I'm always stage ready, but that's not the case for people who have so frequently been disenfranchised, you know? Right. So I'm asking for a little patience and grace, recognition that you're going to get it wrong. You are. And that's okay. Do not fault yourself, you know? Recognize, hold on. Sorry, my cousin called me during the, and I had a moment and I was firing and I lost it.
Keep going. You're right back. Go keep going. You're on it.
So, you know, recognize the fact that you're going to be uncomfortable. And I need you to be okay with that. And for so frequently, when white people are uncomfortable, they change gears and look away. And once again, I'm going to ask you to not look away. Guys, still on a Zoom meeting. Just calm down. Sorry, congregation.
It's all right. You don't have any naked children running behind you like I did, so you're cool.
Sorry.
You know,
okay.
You're good.
Yeah. And so then also look at where you can support local movements, support local things, investing in Black businesses, making these small things, seeing how, you can just, in addition to supporting local, making sure that in doing so, maybe you add something that might not normally be in your lexicon, you know, whether it is like the performance of Africa or Africaville, or whether it's these panel conversations. I've had so many Zoom panel conversations that for me, it is something that has now become second nature, you know, having these conversations on race. But for so many people who have tuned in, maybe the series was this first time for you. So continue to take forays into that. And just more specifically, like I said, the Zenith Youth Program is really something that I'm standing behind. I'm trying to work with the Shinnecock as the Shinnecock Youth Coordinator, and working with the youth to continue to help build their programs. We have a Blossom Sustainable Development Program, which is really working on Native mental health and being able to kind of figure out what this convoluted existence means for our youth and how to process it. So yeah, the first step is really within your backyard. Figure out the microaggressions that you might be holding. Figure out the small reactions that you might have. And not overtly, you know, we're not talking about overt racism, but what are the small things? Do you move your purse when you see a person of color walk past? Like, do you find yourself, you know, how are you in groups of, I know we don't really do groups anymore now that COVID's here, but like how many people of color are in your circle? Because like that start there. Like how many do you know? But then also, like, don't go to your employer, one of your employees, and be all aggressive and be like, hey, I need a Black friend. You know, we want this to happen, this evolution to happen naturally. We don't want to put the onus on them. But if you don't, then that's something, if you don't have people of color in your network, that is something that you really have to do some internal reflection on. And I can't help you with that. Only you can.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
And Andrina, I really love what you said. Something that I want to add to that. When you're fighting for these causes, please don't contradict Black leaders. and leaders of color. You know, I'm a leader on Select Progressives. It means I moderate the chat a lot. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to sit there and read through conversations where a Black person was like, oh, here's why the phrase defund the police is actually appropriate. And then white people are like, oh, no, you can't say that. And I'm like, okay, this is all stemming from conversations around us. If you're going to have disagreement, this isn't the place. You don't need to continuously contradict Black leaders. You don't need to continuously tell them that they're wrong or that they're not justified or that what they're saying is not correct. This is your fight, but it didn't start as your fight. I should say this started around people that look like us, not around people that look like you. That's something that I do want to mention. Now, as Andrina said, this translates into checking your own biases because we don't do that enough. We all know the "I'm not racist," but people, you know, the people that phrase always followed by the most racist crap you'll ever hear. But more importantly, I see it with a lot of people, and I see it extremely prevalent in white liberals because I see it in people who are very socially aware but are literally not aware of any of the things that they're doing, and this translates into real world consequences. Did you know that studies show that some medical students still believe that Black people feel less pain than white people?
Right, I read that.
And that a lot of times Black people in the hospital are ignored when they're crying out in pain and told to just suck it up or told that they're exaggerating. I've read a lot of stories about Black people and other people of color going into hospitals and the doctors talking to the families outside and the families being like, oh, yeah, you know, he's a good man, you know, very college educated, has a PhD, you know, professional, because that's what they think they need to tell them to make sure that the person receives the proper treatment in the hospitals. A question on the chat that I saw, and I just wanted to address in the same vein, was about healthcare and the discrepancies in healthcare. And part of it goes to the fact that minority communities do not have the same access to healthcare, but even when they do have the access to healthcare, they are not treated equally in the healthcare system. They are treated as second-class citizens. So these biases, these things that you see as small, translate into major real-world consequences. When you see a Black person shot in the back 7 times, is your first response either what is wrong with those police officers or, well, what did he do to deserve it? Because that's what I'm seeing a lot. The second that the news breaks, you know, breaking news, unarmed Black man shot in insert city here, people literally start digging through the internet to figure out what they deserve it. People start trying to find anything that is ever in their past to try to figure it out. It's, you know, did they 5 years ago sneeze the wrong direction when they were walking down the street? And does that justify a shooting? These biases translate into people dying. They translate into people in pain. They translate into people not being able to build lives. And we still don't recognize that because it's too hard for most people to recognize. So if you're watching this, please make sure that you're examining your own biases too, because I guarantee you have them. And what's almost sad about it is that what's actually happening because of that is you're building into the minds of young minority people. They actually did studies with that where they showed they would show a young Black girl a Black doll and a white doll and ask her which one was bad, and they would always pick the Black doll. Because that's what they've done. That's what we've done. We've not only built into the minds of white people that Black people and other minorities are not as good. We built into the minds of Black people that we are inherently worse. That we are inherently something other than white people. And it's more than damaging. It's devastating. Because how do you go through life having a natural predisposition to feel contempt for your own community? It's something that's a real world consequence of not being able to check your own biases, and it's something that I do not see enough people doing.
I think look, for whatever it's worth, for the Jewish community on the call right now, we happen to be in a very good period of the year to be doing that kind of check-in work. You know, what happens basically is the high holidays are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that begin actually a month before, the month that precedes it in the Jewish calendar. And from that point until the holidays, you are meant to basically do what's called cheshbon hanefesh, which means a soul accounting. You're supposed to go each and every day and go into yourself and to try to figure out where are the places where we got to work, right? Not everybody does it, but it is an important part of the experience. And I think what Skyler, Andrina, Mark, what you've helped us to understand tonight, I think, and I can put this again in the eye, is, you know, intentions are very important. Good intentions are wonderful. right? Wanting to be involved, wanting to help is great. But I think what we're hearing, and I think this is important for all of us to hear, is that, yes, we need to be there, we need to be in support, but we can't act as if we have not been a part of this also, okay? You don't have to put on a Klan mask and burn a cross to be a participant in a system that is broken and that has been broken onto the backs of generations worth of people who did not deserve this kind of outcome. We can't, unfortunately, undo the past pain, but we can certainly, as Andrina talked about, I think as Skyler and Mark have done in their work as well, to tell the stories of the past, certainly, but to tell the past stories and to bring these stories to light precisely so that we understand where we are right now and the precipice that we are on and the steps that we need to take collectively to move forward. And quite frankly, without conversations like this, I really don't know if that would be possible. And so I really want to thank all three of you. I know that we probably could have kept you for another hour and a half. And I think, to be honest with you, my thought is we'd love to bring all three of you back to continue the conversation. I never had any illusions that we would be able to touch every question or consider every possibility. But please know, as a beginning of a relationship with our community, and we hope with the extended community of the East End that we have become a part of, that we can begin to make the kinds of changes that you have laid out for us this evening. And I really do appreciate, again, the seriousness and sincerity and the honesty with which you have all shared. And I just really want to give the last word to the three of you. And again, to thank everybody who's been on tonight. And Mark, I know that we probably won't have a chance to play it, but perhaps as your last word, you can tell everybody what they ought to be listening to of Dylan's song. But Andrina, Skyler, Mark, please take the last word and whatever else you have to share with us before we close this evening.
Let me start first so they'll have the last word.
Excellent.
Okay. One thing for my friends, have you ever heard me talk less?
I don't know whether they can answer it directly, but we'll assume that they were nodding.
No, the point is, there are times when I need to go to the background to let other more important voices be heard. And that's what happened tonight. And that's what I think those of us who are white need to do. Even if it's uncomfortable for us, this is a time for our Black friends, family members, neighbors to be heard, even if it's uncomfortable. And I was deeply moved by Skyler and Andrina's comments. For the audience, I want to leave you with a song. Bob Dylan wrote a song called Blind Willie Mctell, which is the single most powerful reflection by a white songwriter on race and the legacy and the burden of history we all carry. I urge you to listen to this and sit with it and take in its meaning, because this is a lifetime commitment, as Andrina said. It's not something, you fix and twinkle, a couple of things. This is a lifetime commitment. Listen, learn, and work for change.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark. I super appreciate it. And yeah, this is the fight. Welcome in it. You're here now, and we're not gonna clean up the floor for you. We're not gonna. You're in the trenches now, and you can, at any point. Unlike myself, unlike Skyler, you can choose to look away if it gets too hard. And I'm begging you, please don't. Please stay with this challenge, because it is a challenge that people of color have not only been living their whole lives, but are generationally experiencing. And so, yeah, just recognize that, again, like Mark said, when he first said that, I thought that was a song. I'm like, me talk less? I'm like, wait, no, God, Mark is so hip. And so, yeah, really be prepared to sit in conversations that might be uncomfortable for you. And until Skyler said, because I'm on my phone, guys, until Skyler said someone in the question and comments, I didn't even know they were, I couldn't see them. I knew they were there. I did not have an access them on my phone. And I wanted to answer someone's question regarding residency. People year round, I have lived here for so long that year round people are great. The new flock of summer people that we get are like, but she doesn't have a white baby. Why is she here? If she's not a nanny, what is she doing here? Because they don't recognize, because people haven't talked about the res, because people don't talk about as the res, because we don't talk about the existence of people of color in this community because it interferes with this, like, Hampton's narrative. And so, yeah, it gets harder and harder because before, again, that radiant Andrina, which I had to vibrate through my life, is no longer working. It's not enough because now people are just racist. And so when I feel this hostility in the town of my ancestral homeland, I can't express the dismay. And so, again, I just am asking for personal responsibility in this. You know, it's hard. I have friends who are like, okay, well now, like, I know, and am I being racist, or is it not being racist, or is this awkward, and what do I do? Welcome to my world. That is what I had to do to survive. I'm only asking you to do it to have a conversation. So give yourself a little more credit. You can do that.
Thank you, Andrew.
And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate everything you've had to say, especially because you've also echoed some things that I felt that I haven't even necessarily even articulated. But something that you've touched on a lot tonight. The conversations are always framed in the mindset of white comfort. It's always framed in the mindset of what will not make white people uncomfortable, and that's what you said earlier, Andrina. And it's true. It's always about how can we do this without making white people uncomfortable. We even see this in the protests in the wake of George Floyd. I got to tell you, if I read one more, well, you know, I agree with. I know why they're protesting, but you know, do they really need to insert statement about either looting or rioting or violence there? Oh, okay, that's not important here. Black people and any other minorities have been being decimated for centuries. If you're uncomfortable here, that's welcome to our world. That's just a taste of what we've been feeling for centuries. Our ancestors were slaves. Their lands were taken. They were destroyed. They were killed. They were murdered. They were separated by drinking fountains. They were kept off trains. They were told that they were second-class citizens. They were told that they were something other than their white counterparts. So I'm sorry if you're uncomfortable here, but no, I'm not, because that's what we've been dealing with, not only for our entire lives, but for our families' entire lives. It's something that's going to continue. It's something that is continuing. We do not get to be on the side. We do not get to be on the side of comfort ever in these conversations, because even when we should be, even when this should be where we're comfortable, we're uncomfortable because we need to deal with how you feel. We need to worry that we're going to upset you and that you're going to shut down these conversations. And it is so tiring. Even politics is framed to deal with white people. Politics especially is framed to deal with white people. I ran a race in a 5-way primary where 3 of the candidates were white. And I can tell you that no offense to them, and even even the fact that that's even my first instinct to say, but some of the stuff that they said was ludicrous because they don't deal with this. I had another candidate tell me and the other minority candidate in the middle of a debate that, quote, minority communities want the police there. Because that's what we're being told. That's how everything works. Where everything is always framed, as Andrina said earlier, in the mindset of the white people. It's always framed as how comfortable the conversation can be for people that are white. It's an instinct that's built into the minds of all minority communities. As you talk, make sure you're not offending the white people. Make sure that what you say is kosher enough that they will not be mad at the end of this conversation. And it's something that's almost instinctual at this point, and it's something that's exhausting because it is in every conversation that we have. Again, with politics, it's the idea that any bills that we pass needs to make sure that we're keeping the white people of the state or of the country, of the town, comfortable. What we're doing has been working. Something that I try to do at rallies is I always try to give people a concrete goal. So for a while, my goal was to get people to call or even just to tweet or put on Facebook to repeal Measure 50A of the civil law, which basically kept records of violence and misconduct by police in their personnel files. And we got 50A repealed. We've been fighting for that for decades. The police unions always come out and give one speech and it shuts it down because of the incredible power of the unions. We got it repealed. Within a couple of weeks, the legislature voted and it passed overwhelmingly. And that's something that's never happened before. So as Andrina was saying, please keep having these conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they are for you, because welcome to what we're dealing with. Every conversation is uncomfortable for us because we're worried about you being uncomfortable, even if we don't want to be worried about you being uncomfortable. Yeah. It's always the threat of, if you're too loud or too outspoken, you know, your job's not going to hire you. You're not going to be, you're going to be treated differently in society. We're dealing with that anyway. So when you have these conversations, it changes the narrative, because if we have these conversations all the time, if we normalize these, we can make change and get past the veil of white comfort, because that has been killing us for decades. But overall, I thank you for everyone for being here. This is such an important conversation, and I hope that you'll continue to have them, because this cannot be a one-time thing. This can't be something that you do to feel better about yourself and then never come back to again. If you're part of this, then you need to be part of this, and you need to continue to have these conversations, and you need to continue to strive for change.
And you have to do it knowing you're not getting a pat on the back. You're doing this because this is the right thing to do.
Amen. Look, I am convinced that really the three of you should be giving the high holiday sermons this year, not me. I think I will do my very best to convey what you have shared with us tonight. But I, as much as one person can promise anything in this world, I will promise you that as long as I'm the rabbi of this congregation, this will not be the last conversation that we are having. And I thank you really all
Rabbi Dan,
for challenging us, for pushing us, and for being just your wonderful selves. And I really, I hope very much that as I said, that we can have you back, ideally in a world in which we can all be in the same room together. But if we have to wait for that, we'll wait for that. Keep doing your incredible work. Keep inspiring. And really, thank you again for your time, your energy, and your commitment. We really, really appreciate it deeply.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night. Thank you, everybody again who watched. And in a few hours, the recording will be up online unless I hear otherwise. All right. Thank you again, guys.
Great.
Take care.
All right. Bye.